Hello everyone, this is the Unit 7 Review Guide. Unit 7 begins with the Spanish-American War. Some background to the war was in the 1800s, Spain's empire was falling apart. Most of its colonies in Americas had already become independent. The island of Cuba, however, remained under Spanish rule, and that's where tensions began to rise. The U.S. had long been interested in Cuba, partly because of the economic ties. American businesses had invested heavily in Cuban sugar plantations, and partly because of geography and strategic interest, many Americans supported Cuban independence, seeing it as another chapter in the global spread of democracy. But there were also some imperialist motives. Some believed the U.S. should expand its power by taking colonies like European empires had done. Some causes of the war were the Cuban Rebellion. Cuban revolutionaries, led by José Martí, launched a war for independence against Spanish colonial rule. Spain responded with brutal tactics, including forcing civilians into reconcentration camps, where many died from disease and starvation. Another was yellow journalism. U.S. newspapers, especially those owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, used sensationalized stories to stir public outrage. Now, this was called yellow journalism, and it painted Spain as a cruel opposer. Hearst famously said, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Another was the De Lome letter, a private letter from the Spanish ambassador Enrique Duque de Lome was leaked. In it, he insulted President William McKinley, calling him weak. Americans were furious, and it flamed anti-Spanish sentiment. The last but not least was the explosion of the USS Maine. On February 15th, 1898, the U.S. Maine, a U.S. battleship docked in Havana Harbor, exploded, killing 266 sailors. Though the cause was unclear, newspapers blamed Spain. The rallying cry became, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Then the war would soon begin. Congress declared war on April 1898. McKinley claimed it was to liberate Cuba, but many Americans saw it as a chance to flex military power and possibly acquire territory. Despite only lasting 4 months, the war had several major battles, those being the Battle of Manila Bay, the Cuba Campaign, and acquiring Puerto Rico. The war would end with the Treaty of Paris in 1898. By August, Spain had asked for peace. The terms of the treaty were drastically changed America's role in the world. Cuba became independent, but not really. The Platt Amendment later gave the U.S. right to intervene in Cuban affairs and established a permanent naval base in Guantanamo Bay. The U.S. acquired Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and Spain received $20 million for the Philippines. This marked the official beginning of the American Empire. Some aftermath of the war was the Philippine-American War, where Filipinos wanted independence, and hundreds of thousands of Filipinos were killed wanting to fight for their land. There were lots of debates over imperialism because a lot of Americans were divided. Some would find reasons to support it, and some did not like it. The U.S.'s global presence had changed drastically, as they were now seen as a global power, and military reforms and modernization occurred, and it led to modern professional army and navy, which would be crucial coming in World War I and beyond.
Between 1900 and 1920, the United States experienced a wave of change known as the Progressive Era. This was a time when reformers sought to fix the social, political, and economic problems caused by a rapid industrialization, urbanization, and corruption. Progressives believed that the government should take a more active role in addressing issues like poverty, unsafe working conditions, child labor, and environmental destruction. Muckraking journalists like Upton Sinclair exposed horrors in the industry such as meatpacking, which led to important reforms like the Pure Food and Drug Act. Another reformer was Jane Addams, who opened settlement houses to support immigrants and the poor, while others fought for labor rights, public health, and education. Women played a major role in the movement, especially in the long struggle for the right to vote, which was finally achieved with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. As far as presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson helped lead the charge, with Roosevelt breaking up monopolies and conserving natural resources, and Wilson pushing for banking reform and worker protections. Although World War I shifted attention away from domestic reforms, the Progressive Era left a lasting impact by expanding the role of government and laid the groundwork for future social movements, even if many groups, especially minorities, were left out of its benefits.
At first, the United States didn't want to get involved in the war that started in Europe in 1914. President Woodrow Wilson wanted to stay out of it, and most Americans agreed, but staying neutral became harder over time. One of the biggest problems was Germany's use of submarines. Germany began sinking ships in the Atlantic Ocean without warning, even ones with Americans on board. In 1915, a German submarine sank the Lusitania, killing over 100 Americans. People were angry, but the US still didn't join the war. Then, in 1917, the Zimmermann telegraph was discovered. Germany had secretly asked Mexico to attack the US if we went to war with Germany. In return, Germany promised to help Mexico get back land it had lost, like Texas and Arizona. This was the final straw. In April 1917, the US declared war on Germany. The government had to get ready fast. The Selective Service Act started a draft where men had to sign up for the military. Millions were drafted. The government created new programs to control what factories made, and people were told to grow food in victory gardens and eat less meat and wheat to help soldiers. To get support for the war, the government used propaganda, posters, movies, and speeches that told Americans to support the troops and buy Liberty bonds to help pay for the war. Also, women and Black Americans also saw big changes. Many women got jobs in factories while men were fighting overseas. This helped build support for the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote in the 1920s. At the same time, the Great Migration began. African Americans moved to the south to the north to get jobs and escape racism. This changed cities and led to both new opportunities and new tensions. After the war, President Wilson had a plan for peace called the 14 Points. He wanted countries to work together in a new group called the League of Nations so there wouldn't be more wars. But the US Senate said no. They didn't want to be dragged into another country's problems. America went back to being more isolated, meaning they'd stay out of world affairs. After the war ended, life in the US changed fast. The 1920s were a time of new inventions, new music, and a major social change. The economy was booming, factories were making more goods than ever, and new products like cars, radios, and refrigerators. Henry Ford's assembly line made cars cheaper, so people could afford them. People started buying on credit, which meant they could get things now and pay later. This helped businesses grow. The 1920s were also a time of fun and freedom, especially for young people. Jazz music became popular, and a new style of women called flappers wore shorter dresses, danced in clubs, and showed more independence. More people listened to the radio and went to the movies, which helped create a shared American culture. The Harlem Renaissance was a big cultural movement among African Americans, especially in New York. Writers like Langston Hughes and musicians like Duke Ellington celebrated Black life and challenged racism throughout art and music. But not everything was fun. After the war, there was a Red Scare, a time where Americans were afraid of communism spreading to the US. The government arrested and deported people they thought were radicals. Also, during the 1920s, Prohibition made it illegal to make or sell alcohol. The 18th Amendment started it, and the Volstead Act explained the rules, but people still found a way to drink. Speakeasies, secret bars became popular, and gangsters like Al Capone made millions by selling illegal alcohol.
The 1920s were roaring. America was booming with jazz music, mass production, and a soaring stock market. Cars rolled off assembly lines, radios filled homes, and people were buying big, often with money they didn't have. But beneath the glamour, cracks were forming. Farmers were overproducing and drowning in debt. Income inequality was rising. Stock prices were inflated by speculation and buying on margin, borrowing money to buy stocks. And then came the crash. On October 29, 1929, known as Black Tuesday, the stock market collapsed. Billions vanished in a few hours. It wasn't just a Wall Street crisis. Soon it was everywhere. As banks failed, over 9,000 in just a few years, people rushed to withdraw savings. But for many, it was already gone. Businesses were shut down, factories went silent, and unemployment soared high. By 1932, nearly 25% of Americans were unemployed. In cities, bread lines stretched for blocks. In the countryside, dust bowl storms buried farms. Desperation was everywhere. President Herbert Hoover believed the government should stay out of the economy. He pushed for volunteerism and limited aid, but his response was seen as too little, too late. Public anger boiled over. The bonus army, veterans demanding early payment, was tear gassed in D.C. Hoover's popularity plummeted. In the 1932 election, Americans demanded change. And with that change came Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In 1933, he took office in the depths of the Great Depression. 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed, banks were collapsing, and confidence in democracy was fading. In his inaugural address, FDR declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." He launched the New Deal, a sweeping set of programs focused on 3 goals: relief for the suffering, recovery of the economy, and reform to prevent future depressions. In just his first 100 days, Congress passed dozens of laws. The CCC put young men to work planting trees and building trails. The TVA brought electricity and jobs to the rural South. The FDIC ensured bank deposits, and the NRA tried to stabilize wages and prices through the Supreme Court later struck it down. The second New Deal went further. The WPA hired artists, writers, and construction crews. The Social Security Act created pensions and unemployment insurance, and the Wagner Act protected workers' rights to unionize. Still, the New Deal faced major opposition. Conservatives called it socialist, and while populists like Huey Long wanted even more radical change. And even when the Supreme Court struck down more programs, FDR tried to add more justices in his infamous court packing plan. By the end of the 1930s, the economy had improved, but full recovery only came with World War II. Still, the New Deal left a lasting legacy: Social Security, labor protections, banking reform, and the new idea that the federal government should play an active role in economic life. The New Deal didn't exactly end the Depression, but it redefined American government, expanded its power, and reshaped the relationship between citizens and the state for generations to come.
Before World War II, the U.S. was mostly focused on staying out of global conflicts. After the devastation of World War I, a lot of Americans supported isolationism, which led to laws like the Neutrality Acts. But while the U.S. tried to stay out of world conflicts, the fascist leaders like Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy were gaining power, and Japan was very aggressively expanding into Eastern Asia. As war broke out in Europe in 1939, the U.S. started to get more involved by helping allies through policies such as cash and carry and the Lend-Lease Act. Everything changed on December 7, 1941, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. That attack pushed the U.S. into the war, both in Europe and the Pacific. At home, the country mobilized quickly. Factories shifted to wartime production, and people from all backgrounds were brought into the workforce. Women filled industrial jobs in very large numbers, and African Americans fought for civil rights while also serving in the military in defense jobs. This ended up leading to Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in war industries. Around this time, Japanese Americans were also being forced into internment camps under Executive Order 9066, which was upheld by the Supreme Court in Korematsu v. United States later on in the war. On the battlefield, the U.S. helped lead the Allied invasion of Europe on D-Day in 1944, which led to Germany's surrender in May 1945. In the Pacific, the U.S. used island hopping to get closer to Japan, fighting very brutal battles such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The war ended after the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. After the war, the U.S. emerged as a global superpower and helped create the United Nations.